Hey, so a question I get a lot is about description of scenes. What is the space like? Where are we? And a lot of writers, particularly beginning writers, don't really know how, or more to the point, when it's important to describe settings and places. A lot of the time, you end up with what's called white room syndrome. I have it right here as a title, where you have a pair of characters interacting, and you actually really don't have any sense of where they are. Um, but of course, on the other end of that, if you're not careful, you can end up with really long, almost sludgy blocks of expositional description of scenes, so you have like a purple prose where it's like every single detail is just slammed in there with no real care for, kind of what or why. So I figured what I'd do is sit down and maybe do some cute little exercises with this. Because there's a bunch of different ways to approach scene setting. Um, so I've decided sort of arbitrarily, I decided in the show today, let's do like a laboratory scene. So that's where we are. But how do we approach this? Well, when we set a scene and when we describe a scene, we need to make sure that it has meaning, right? And the amount that we describe has a lot to do with what we want that meaning to be. So if you're, taking kind of a minimalist approach, what does that mean? Seeing only matters insofar as it affects the characters and their interactions, seen as context. By scene, of course, I actually mean setting. But I use the two I use the two incorrectly as though they're the same word. So what's an example of that? So if we have a laboratory setting, I don't know, let's give it a try. It's down Jane and Dustin, which is important. So it makes them feel at least that they are still at work. Never mind the hour, and never mind their eyes, which would never have dared to meet like this, trying to be right. So, in this little snippet that I've written, what are we doing? Are we having a lot of sort of scene details? Not really. Like the only thing I've actually said about the laboratory is that they're in the laboratory, but I've said that it's important that they're in the laboratory. Really, I'm keeping the focus on Jane and Dustin and the relationship between them. And as the scene goes on, you know, potentially you would more details as relevant, right? But you're really keeping the focus on these two characters. Another approach is sort of personification or impression. I always want to say impressionism, right? Communicate the setting through the feeling of being there, much less about sort of actual physical details. Like you could say, like, oh, half of the beakers in the laboratory were glass with thick bottom, or like, you could give that detail, but it's you can get a lot more out of it by saying like what matters or what does it feel like. So like for instance, So this is a different like way of looking at it, right? So I'm focusing on an object, sort of, or a set of objects, the beakers, right, in the laboratory. But these beakers, I'm kind of focusing less on like I give you a tiny bit of information about the number of them and sort of the various like half of this and half of that. But like really what this is about is like a feeling of them, right? And you can maybe like when you read this, like are you able to picture the space necessarily? Do you get an image? Maybe you do. The image that you get actually is the shine of a glass beaker, just like that little like reflective, like it's difficult to describe in other words, but like you get that little like shimmer, right, of glass. And that's actually the only image you get. I don't tell you how big the lab or small it is, but you get that image, and that's the image that I want you to have because that's the image that creates the feeling of being watched. And what does that feeling of being watched do? That sets a tone. So what do we notice? It's like very tonal. Tonal creates a feeling that persists and colors future interactions within space. And more to the point, it's repeatable language. So why do I say that? What I say is that these beakers can show up again and again throughout the whole scene. This part of the setting can recur. I've I've personified the beakers, the glass ones at least, as watching and witnessing. What do they see? Whenever something happens in the scene, I have the option now of of bringing back those beakers and being like the beakers watch as, right? Or even like the character like Jane hopes the beakers will keep this secret for them, right? Sort of use it again. That lets you start to kind of layer your setting into the text itself, right? I think that's really helpful. And then one last approach I want to play with, just briefly, is it's a piece of advice I give all the time. ABTS. Always be telling stories. So what does that mean? Always be telling stories. Really, it's a philosophy of writing. It applies to more than just setting. It applies to every part of this process. We're storytellers, right? If we're fiction, even if we're nonfiction writers, we're storytellers most, if not all of the time. And if we're storytellers, what should we be doing? We should be telling stories. Every challenge, like introducing a setting or a character or a plot element, every challenge is itself an opportunity to tell a little story. People love stories, they latch onto it. So how would this work? Here's an example. First, So what am I focusing on? Like sort of the openness of the space, kind of a singular room. And again, I'm sort of spitballing all of this, right? When I do this. So it kind of, hold on, delightful. Um, I'm sort of spitballing all of this. So like, is this what I'd write in a real story? Like I would probably like, do it a little slower, like, you know, actually make it make a little more sense in this. But the point is like use storytelling techniques, setup, payoff, etc., to disguise scene setting, right? Sure, I'm telling you ostensibly that the lab is a large open space with no side rooms, but I'm telling you why it's that way, as opposed to just giving you that information. I'm telling you a story about how it happened. I'm telling you a story about Jane hearing the story that she can't even remember. I'm telling you a story about why it matters that it's big. It's stories, stories, stories. I'm telling you about an unintended consequence of the story, right? So always be telling stories. Now, again, does this create a strong visual impression? No, but we've only just started. We have a sense of space, but I could keep going and get a lot more details, right? And really, what you want to do is take these and these different techniques and kind of cross them over. Use some here, some there. But the point is that just a long list of details, generally, it doesn't get you anywhere. I hope this is helpful. I hope it's fun. And thanks for tuning in.